Okay. Lynn Downie is a professor of journalism at the Cronkite School at Arizona State. He was Washington Post executive editor from 1991 to 2008. He's promoting his new book, All About the Story, News, Politics, Power, and the Washington Post. During his 44 years in the newsroom, he was also an investigative reporter, editor on local and national news staffs, London correspondent, and from 84 to 91 was managing editor under Ben Bradley. As deputy Metro editor from 72 to 74, Lynn helped supervise the Post's Watergate coverage. He also oversaw the coverage of every national election from 84 through 2008. And during his 17 years as executive editor, the Post won 25 Pulitzer Prizes. So a really remarkable career, and we're lucky to have him here at the University of Florida tonight. Lynn, talk to me about your early years. Many students here at the University of Florida are also first-year college students. How and why did you get into journalism at such an early age? How important were your experiences working on student publications?
My experiences on student publications were very formative. And it actually began when I was in the 5th grade in a public school in Cleveland, Ohio. Had an English teacher that loved journalism and started a little student newspaper on mimeograph, sheets of mimeograph paper. In the 5th grade, I was a reporter for it. I still have my first story here in my house. And in the 6th grade, I was the editor, and I fell in love with journalism. I also fell in love with being an editor too, which I then forgot about for a while after that. And then I continued to pursue student journalism in junior high school in Cleveland, where Donna Shalala was a co-editor with me of our junior high school newspaper. She then went on to do important things in Washington and Florida, among other places, now in Congress. In high school, same thing. Usually I started as a sports reporter, then sports editor, and then the editor of the student newspaper. And the same thing in college at Ohio State University. And then as a result of that, I became a summer intern at the Washington Post in 1964. And it was a time when newspapers were hiring a lot more maybe than now. I did a good job during the summer and was hired on and never left.
You landed your internship at the Post and quickly earned a full-time job on the Metro staff. How do you differentiate yourself and impress the editors that you're working with? Sort of, what are the best practices, and
Right.
What's the worst thing you could do?
Right. Well, the best thing in this case, the city editor, who wasn't much older than the interns, saw that another intern named Bob Kaiser, who was in his second summer internship. I was in my first. He came from Yale University. His father was the deputy chief of mission of the American Embassy in London. In other words, a real blue blood guy. And I'm this kid from Cleveland, Ohio, and a land grant University, Ohio State. And so the city editor thought, let's have a competition between these two guys. And at the end of the summer, we each had 13 stories in the paper. As a result, we were offered jobs. So my first advice would be for summer interns to simply work really hard. Do everything that you're asked to do, and then look to see if there are other things you can do. Some of those 13 stories of mine were not assigned to me. I found them. That's what you want to. That's what you want to be doing too. And also, you need to find a mentor. In this case, the city editor was a mentor to me and Bob. And you want to find somebody during that summer who's going to help you understand the place where you're working, make sure you're doing what you ought to be doing, and can give you good advice.
Let me jump ahead and ask you about modern newsrooms and modern newspaper. Are there subjects or areas of expertise that you can recommend for a young journalist, specialized knowledge that
Yes.
might be useful in the coming decade?
Right. Two things I would say about that. One is it's really important, and I assume you can do this at your school in Florida too, is to learn all the skills involved in digital journalism nowadays. So even if you love reporting and writing, don't stop there. Learn how to use a television camera and video camera. Learn how to take photography. Learn how to do things on the web. things that I can't even discuss with the right names right now because I don't know them, but my students do, and they educate me about it. So you want to be multi-skilled, so that a lot of the jobs that are now available to younger people in news organizations are jobs that involve digital technology in addition to journalism, and you want to be able to do that. In terms of subject matter, clearly economic reporting, business reporting, local business reporting is increasingly important, particularly during the period we're going through now where the American economy is completely changing. But also it's still important to be able to cover government, to be able to read data, to be able to read budgets, and things like that. It's journalism nowadays is not just about interviewing, but it's also about mastering all the information that's available digitally.
You advanced pretty early in your career, kind of felt the lure to write impactful investigative stories. Tell us the difference between some of these projects and covering a spot or a breaking news story. What's your mindset going in? How is it different?
Your mindset is to dig deeper than you can dig in daily coverage. My first investigative project's a good example of this. Ben Bradley, years before me, and the city editor Steve Isaacs a few years before me had both covered what was called then the DC Court of General Sessions. It was run by the federal government, but it was the local court for the District of Columbia, the local criminal and civil court. And they both knew that it was a mess. But they didn't have time to do investigative reporting about it because they were covering the news. And so was the current beat reporter, the then current beat reporter. So they sent me down there just to see what I could do about finding out about why it was such a mess. And kept the beat reporter there to cover trials and things. So you dig deeper. So I had to do my own statistics on what happened to criminal cases in the court, judge shopping and differences in sentencing, and also just observe what was going on in the hallways where people were drinking openly. Deals were being made amongst lawyers and prosecutors that should not have been made in the hallways. Judges were misbehaving on the bench. One judge spent his afternoons drunk in his chambers, and his clerk conducted court shouting back to him about what he was actually doing in the courtroom, et cetera. And so it means digging deeply, and showing that something's not working the way it should be working. It's holding accountable institutions and people that have power in our society. And as a result of those stories that were published when I was 24 years old, I was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. And more importantly, the Johnson administration abolished the Court of General Sessions, and it in Congress replaced it with what today is the DC Superior Court. And so that launched me on investigative reporting for a number of years before I became a local editor.
Lynn, how do you convince reluctant sources to speak with you? In that case, the judges and the attorneys, I mean, they all had a vested interest in sort of continuing the status quo.
Right. Bob Woodward has always has a mantra for this, which I realized it was probably what I was doing too. You ask people to help you. So there was a really good prosecutor in the court who cared about what was going on. There were a couple of judges who cared about what was going on, and I asked them to help me, literally help me. Tell me what was wrong with what I was seeing. Tell me how it would work if it was working properly. So that's often a way to get sources to open up to you. The other way is to confront people with the problems that you've seen. So there was a bail bondsman, for instance, that I confronted with what I thought he was doing wrong, and that's one way. That's one way to get somebody to talk. He actually insisted I go out to dinner with him, and he put ketchup all over his steak. But I somehow managed to survive that, and still got him to talk to me because he wanted his stories told. He didn't want just what I might be saying without reporting, without what he had to say.
Then on the flip side, we have the issue of access journalism, where there is some reticence among some reporters to write critically about the activities of their own sources. They want to make sure these people continue to be their sources and continue to return their phone calls. You're afraid that people will stop talking to you. So how do you overcome that?
You should not do favors for your sources. You should get to know them well. You should have empathy for them. You should know who their kids are and their husbands and wives and so on, but not become their friends. And they have to know that. They have to know that you're going to play it straight. You're always going to give them the opportunity to make sure that their side is known to you, that they have a say in they can say what they think the facts are, but you're not going to do any favors for them. My favorite example for that was the late Ann Devroy, who covered starting with the Reagan administration on through the beginning of the Clinton administration, and she was, for one thing, you just constantly stay in touch with your sources, and you show them that you are doing, you're reporting things straight. That they cannot expect you to do them favors, but they can expect you to try to tell the truth, but she also was tough on them. So I remember a couple things about that. I remember one night when something important had happened. I can't remember what it was. And I had to rush into the newsroom about 10 o'clock at night, and it affected the White House. And before Ann made her way in, because she lived further away than I did, there were already a bunch of phone messages on her desk, starting with Jim Baker, the chief of staff, all the way on down in the White House. They were calling her in order to get their story across. She didn't even have to wait to call them. And another time at the beginning of the Clinton administration, when things were not starting out very well in the press office, there was a lot of confusion. I remember hearing her shouting into the phone from across the newsroom, you're damn right I'm giving you a hard time. You guys should be better organized than this. She was bawling them out. And there was a certain respect for Ann rather than being obsequious and trying to do favors for people.
How would you advise reporters to cope with a situation where a source is threatening to withhold future access if a story is not reported a certain direction or not?
You live with it. It happened to me, and as an editor, running the Post for 24 years, I didn't have any friends. I mean, people that I knew well, when we would publish something they didn't like, would stop talking to me, and that's life. You have to live with that. As for reporters, they can report around it. There are other sources out there, and often you'll get that one source to come back to you when they see that you can get the job done without them, and they want you to know what their version of the story is.
Lynn, we're going to talk about Watergate here. One thing I sort of want to throw out there initially is how many people outside of journalism conflate anonymous and confidential sources. So can you walk us through the difference? And
Right.
Have you ever used information for a story where you did not know its provenance?
No, except for Deep Throat, obviously. Deep Throat was the only source of any of the report, of any of my work or any of the other work in the newsroom when I was an editor, that I didn't know who it was. But we never used anything from Deep Throat in the newspaper. We used it, Bob used it as tips to get the information from other people. We insisted on two. Anytime they're using confidential sources, we insisted on at least two sources for the information who did not trade the information themselves. They had independent knowledge of what was going on. We also insisted that they write memos of all their interviews, detailed memos about their interviews, and that they put the name of the confidential sources at the top. They had the same arrangement with every one of their confidential sources, that they would remain confidential until they died, the source died, or unless the source released the reporter from the confidentiality agreement. And I always say confidential sources rather than anonymous, because anonymous implies that nobody knows who they are. And in fact, the reporter has to know, the reporter's editor has to know, and the reader then has to trust the news organization that they're treating these arrangements properly.
Now during Watergate, even Ben Bradley at one point didn't know that Deep Throat was Mark Felt. In fact, he didn't learn until some time afterward. But that's different now. In modern newsrooms, it's very typical, standard for reporters to identify their confidential sources to their editors. What changed, and why did it change?
No, it didn't change. That was the only one. That was the only. All the other sources were known to me, and to Harry Rosenfeld, the Metro editor. It was a local story, so it was a Metropolitan News Desk story, because it was a local break-in. And Ben could know all the sources that he wanted to know, because we would share the memos with the source's name at the top. So, for instance, when all this guessing was going on over decades about who Deep Throat might be, I knew it, for instance, it was not Alexander Haig, because Alexander Haig was one of the confidential sources named at the top of the memos. and so on, with dozens of people who worked in the White House, the FBI, Justice Department, and so on. So we did know who they were. Nothing changed. It's the same. Deep Throat was the one exception. And as I said, we never published anything only on Deep Throat Say So. It always had to be from other sources, but Deep Throat was helping to lead Bob and to correct Bob if Bob was on the wrong track.
And in fact, on one memo, Bob Woodward, whether he did it by mistake or deliberately, but he wrote the initials MF at the top of the memo.
Yes, and then he said, when asked who MF was, he said, my friend, stood for my friend. And I also was guessing over the years, along with everybody else who Deep Throat might be. And I had the advantage that I know who Deep Throat wasn't. I knew who all those other confidential sources were. So I thought this shouldn't be too hard for me. And I guessed Elliot Richardson at one point, who was the acting attorney general, was fired during the Saturday Night Massacre. And so I thought he would have he could well be the Deep Throat. And I had to wait until he died, unfortunately. And then Bob told me, no, he's not. And then I guessed L. Patrick Gray, who had been the acting FBI director, also fired by President Nixon, and also was not one of the named sources on the memos. And Bob didn't even wait for him to die to tell me, no, it's not L. Patrick Gray. And so I really thought about it hard. And during the time I was investigative reporter or editing investigative reporter, I can't remember which, I had reason to call Mark Feld on a couple of occasions when he was the #3 director of the FBI. He was #2 during Watergate. And I just remember what a straight shooter he was, and he seemed smart. And I realized that his name was not one of those on the memos. And so I put his name into an envelope with an explanation and gave it to Bob. And I said, when Deep Throat dies, open up this envelope and see if I'm right. Time went by, and Bob has always been a very generous public speaker, speaks a lot on college campuses, and was always asked about Deep Throat. And he began saying, well, he's very sick, and so he may die soon, and then you'll find out who he is, because that releases me from my confidentiality agreement. So I called Bob into my office, and I said, my God, if Deep Throat's going to die, we have to be ready to cover this. And he was sort of sheepish with me in a way which I knew he was protecting some secret. And so I asked him, what's going on here? And he had written a book about his relationship with Mark Feld that he was saving until he died. And I said, Bob, that's fine. That you've written that book, but I still want everything in the newspaper the day after he dies and the day after that, including everything that I want out of your book. And so he's always been, despite being so rich and famous, he's always treated me as his boss. And so he had me over to his house in Georgetown, and we had a nice breakfast, and he brought out his manuscript, and sure enough, it was Mark Feld. And then after that, some more time passed. And Mark Feld's family wanted to have him identified as Deep Throat before he died, because I think they thought they would bask in the glory or make money off it or something. Bob kept in touch with Mark Feld and contacted him again. And he is so suffering from dementia that Bob was convinced that he did not. He only knew that Bob was some old friend. That was all he knew. And so he could not make the decision to release Bob from his confidentiality agreement. So the family went to Vanity Fair magazine and had their lawyer write a piece for them. It popped up online. And then the question was, are we going to identify him now that they have? And Bob didn't want to, because he still hadn't been released by Mark Feld himself. But I said, no, it's over now. We have to acknowledge who it is. And we put all the stories in the paper. And then people would ask afterwards, don't you feel bad that your scoop was stolen by Vanity Fair magazine? And I said, no, quite the contrary. It showed that we would go to every ends to protect a confidential source. And as a result, in the future, anytime a Washington Post reporter promised confidentiality to a source, that the people would believe that they would keep their promise.
Watergate was such a seminal moment in American journalism. What was your role as deputy? It was deputy Metro editor, and
yes,
talk to us about the role
I'd been on leave of absence on a fellowship, working on a book, and I'd come back to the newsroom just a week or so after the break-in. And as the deputy metropolitan editor, Harry Rosenfeld was the metropolitan editor, and I was under him, and then under me was the city editor, Barry Sussman. And Barry Sussman was originally in charge of the story, was Bob and Carl's editor, and Harry was over him, and I was helping out. I was actually supervising a lot of the rest of the local coverage to begin with, because Watergate was dominating Harry's time. But then as time went on, I became part of the chain of command to review Watergate stories before they were published. It was so important that we did not make any mistakes. And then by the time the Senate Watergate hearings began, Barry was off writing a book, and I was in charge of all of the Watergate coverage, including Bob and Carl's work and our coverage of the Senate Watergate Committee, and ultimately impeachment from the investigative point of view. Our national staff took over coverage of the impeachment itself and the resignation.
And there were, even in the early days, there were competing interests within the Post. The national staff kind of wanted a bigger part earlier in Watergate.
Even before that, there was skepticism. Most of the political reporters in the country, including those in our same newsroom, didn't believe this story. They thought we were a bunch of crazy kids on the local staff of the Washington Post were off the reservation. And they just didn't believe it. But then as time went on and they began to believe it, by the time I was in charge of the coverage, then they wanted in. And I told them, no, this started as our story, stayed as our story. And Ben Bradley backed us up, and it remained our story.
You'd mentioned how important it was that you not make any reporting mistakes. But during Watergate, Woodward and Bernstein made at least one serious mistake about who was implicated in grand jury testimony. How can you recover from publishing a serious factual error, especially when you're subject to such scrutiny by the president, the administration?
Fortunately, the error was half of what they reported was an error, and the other half was not. The half that was not, that was accurate, was that H.R. Haldeman was the final and most important signatory on cash, taking money out of the Committee to Re-elect Fund for the Watergate cover-up. But the part that was wrong was that one of his aides had already testified about this to a grand jury. And in fact, he had appeared before the grand jury, but he wasn't asked about it. So he didn't testify to that. And so we went about correcting that. We wrote a story the next day. Peter Osnos, who later wound up founding the publishing company that published my book, wrote a story explaining what was going on. And then by a day later, we were able to say that, in fact, the Haldeman part was true, and it was just premature that his aide had testified before the grand jury. So that was our one mistake. But it was scary because, as I said, for the longest time, we were all alone on this story, and under constant criticism from the Nixon administration, very much like what President Trump is now doing with the news media generally. Nixon and his aides were visiting on the Washington Post singularly at the time, and so we were very concerned about making mistakes.
You describe in your book an early investigation you were reporting that upset some savings and loan executives. Yeah. And they even came to see Ben Bradley in his office and complained about your line of questioning prior to publication. What was Ben's response, and how important is it for an editor to support his investigative reporters? Yeah,
it's essential. The savings and loan presidents were in Ben's office saying that he came out to where I was working. I had very few conversations with him at that point. I was a young investigative reporter, and he was Ben Bradley. And so I was alarmed when he came over to see me and asked me what I was doing. And I started to give him a long-winded answer like the ones I'm giving you. And he shut me off because he's got a short attention span. And he says, I got these guys in my office. They're going to say they're going to pull all their ads from the Post if we run your story. And then he paused. And then he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, just get it right, kid, and walked away. And we published the series, and they did pull all their ads for an entire year at a time when that amount of money meant a lot to the Post. Nobody at the Post told me that they did it. I had to notice it myself and do some investigative reporting in our advertising department to find out how much that cost the Post. And I decided this is where I want to be. And that's essential for supporting investigative reporting. It's essential that you not be influenced by advertisers, that you not be influenced by the government. And that was certainly the case for me during the quarter century that I ran the newsroom.
Lynn, tell us about your no surprises rule, and why is this an important rule in a newsroom?
Right. I inherited this from Ben. Anybody who's seen All the President's Men movie or the Post movie saw his relationship with Katharine Graham. And part of what made their relationship work was that she gave him absolute control over what went in the newspaper. She'd give him advice, she'd kibitz. Same thing happened between me and Donald Graham, her son, who was the CEO and publisher when I was executive editor. But we always, Ben and I, had the absolute last word on what went in the newspaper. However, we wanted to be fair to them. If there's going to be something in the newspaper that was going to cause a big ruckus, they should know about it. And so that was the no surprises rule. And then we also enforced it within the newsroom. I wanted to know, when I was running the newsroom, anything that was going on anywhere in the paper, anything that might be going in the paper, any issues in the newsroom that might cause real problems for the newspaper, I wanted to know about them. I was also, more than Ben, very much of a hands-on executive editor, more than most actually. And so I spent a lot of time roaming around the newsroom, getting in the hair of editors and reporters and finding out what they were doing. So that helped, but the no surprises rule was very important.
Probably a good rule for a lot of corporate offices, whether you're in a newsroom or not.
Yes.
We're in the middle of one of the most fascinating and important political campaigns in a few generations. Let's talk about how news organizations cover candidates and public figures, especially their private lives. How has coverage of allegations of infidelity by Donald Trump and Gary Hart, Bill Clinton, and others evolved since the Kennedy administration?
Right.
And moving in the right direction? Should readers care about these things?
Yes, they should. It's important aspects of the character of people who would have very great influence in their lives, people running for president, people, senators, members of Congress, and so on. And there was a time when I was already working at the newspaper when that wasn't being reported on. Nobody reported on Kennedy's many affairs, including with a girlfriend of a mafia chieftain, which would be a very serious issue. And there were there were people that were drunk on the floors of the houses of Congress, and it was never reported on. Gradually, that changed when the then Speaker of the House, Carl Albert, got into a car crash while drunk. And so we reported, the Washington Post reported on that. That was a breakthrough that had never been done before. I was the editor on that story. And then later Wilbur Mills, another very important, the head of the House Ways and Means Committee, was found drunk in a car in the Monument area of Washington, where his then girlfriend had jumped into the reflecting pool. And we wrote about that. We wrote about all the background of that. And so we began. It no longer was verboten to write about the aspects of private lives of Congress, members of Congress, that could affect their public work. Then came Gary Hart. And when Gary Hart was running for president in 1984, one of our reporters, the late George Lardner, discovered that Hart was lying about his age. He shaved a year off his age on most of his public documents, including his driver's license. And it changed his name from Gary Hartpence to Gary Hart because he thought that sounded better for a politician, but lied about the reason. He said his whole family wanted to change his name. That wasn't true. So we ran those two stories, which again was pretty unprecedented. And it began to create doubts amongst our political reporters about his veracity. And so when the Miami Herald discovered that he was apparently spent overnight in the home in Washington of a woman who was not his wife, that led a Washington Post reporter, Paul Taylor, to ask him at a public press conference if he'd ever committed adultery, which was never had happened before in American journalism, and was really a breakthrough. And then it turned out that we found out that he was also seeing regularly another woman in Washington who was well known to members of our staff because of her position in Washington. To this day, she remains a confidential source, and she confirmed the affair to Ben Bradley. And when Gary Hart's campaign was informed of this, he dropped out of the race rather than face another story. So that was a big change. And there was a lot of controversy about that, There were a lot of people who thought that the Post, the Miami Herald, had done the wrong thing to be reporting on his private life. And of course, Gary Hart thought that too. But that changed everything. From then on, that was fair game. I even adopted a rule for how we would cover these things. First of all, because we were constantly getting tips about people's private lives, particularly presidential candidates, which often were false. So the first question was, is it true? And then my next question would be, if it's true, can we prove it? And thirdly, if we can prove it, if it's true and we can prove it, is it really relevant to their character running for president and to their conduct in public office? And that was tested when Bob Dole ran against Bill Clinton after Jennifer Flowers had gone public with her accusations that she had a long affair with Bill Clinton. And so the question was whether or not Bob Dole was going to make that an issue in the campaign. And we got a tip, I think a number of news organizations got a tip very close to the election, that he had an affair 28 years earlier with another woman in Washington at a time when his marriage at that time was failing, his first marriage. And so I called together, and Bob Woodward checked it out, and it was true. And so it was true, and we could prove it. And then the question was about relevance. And so I had meetings with senior political reporters and editors, the majority of them said, yes, we got to publish that, because I had always said that was anything important about the character of a presidential candidate should be published. But David Broder, the late David Broder, who was then our senior political reporter, raised the question of whether or not there should be some statute of limitations on that sort of thing, because it was 28 years ago, that marriage ended. He'd been married to Elizabeth Dole ever since, no problems. And I agreed with him. And since my vote was the one that counted, we did not publish that story. And only the National Enquirer published a story about it. No, none of the rest of the media.
Speaking of secrets, let's shift the conversation to national security. You had a number of really fascinating anecdotes in your book where you describe, as top editor of the Post, you being asked by presidents and others not to publish sensitive information that your reporters uncovered. Can you talk to us about some of these cases, whether it was Pelton or the congressional bunker? Right. The CIA black sites.
There were a number of cases. Usually it was at the level of the CIA director or somebody like that, somebody in the cabinet or somebody in the White House, raising issues about whether or not we should publish a story that they claimed would harm national security. Often it became clear that it wasn't really going to harm national security so much as it was going to harm the reputation of the agency involved, because they screwed up. And they allowed some secret to get out or whatever. So I never did not publish a story when asked to do so, but I did on occasion leave out information that would have been in the story that would give away aspects of a covert action that could harm human life or could harm the covert action, while at the same time publishing the aspects of it that raised real questions about how the government was conducting its business. And the most important one of those was after 9/11, President Bush authorized the CIA to conduct a covert war against terrorists around the world. And as part of that, they established secret sites in Eastern European countries, relatively new democracies from the old Soviet bloc, where they captured terrorists and aggressively interrogated them. What we later found out was definitely torture. So the CIA didn't want us to publish that. Obviously, we had a meeting at the CIA and with the Director of National Intelligence. They set out their reasons for it. And the only reason it made any sense to me was that if we named the countries, it could cut off, two things would happen if we ran this story and named the countries. One was they'd have to bring the prisoners back to the United States within the United States legal system, and I didn't think that was a problem. That's why we were going to run the story, because this was an extra legal effort that raised real questions. And secondly, that if we name the countries, then other kinds of cooperation, counterterrorism cooperation, financial and otherwise, could be in jeopardy. And that struck me as something that probably was a valid concern. So then President Bush brought Don Graham and myself and our then publisher, Bo Jones, to the White House for a meeting with him and the Vice President and the Director of National Intelligence and the Director and the National Security Advisor. And he made his pitch, a similar pitch to the CIA's. And I told him we would make a decision, and it was my decision. not the government's. And Don Graham, as usual, said it was my decision and not his, not the CEO or the publishers. And so I did publish the story without the names of the countries at that point. And it was interesting. The reaction was divided. There were people that strongly criticized me for what they felt was a breach of national security, and other people strongly criticized me for not naming the countries. And ultimately, after 2 years of investigation, the Senate Intelligence Committee came out with a big report that not only substantiated our stories, but also was able to prove that there were torture in those secret prisons. So it was a good thing that we published that story.
How has the calculus within newsrooms changed toward such requests to withhold either a story or individual details? Are we less willing these days to keep the government's secrets?
No, I don't think so. I mean, there have been some over the years, including when I was running the Post, a couple times I thought there were secrets that were published that I would not have published, but I didn't know all the circumstances of that other news organization and why they made that decision. So I'm not criticizing them for it, but that was rare. And as I watch what's going on now in terms of truthful reporting, as opposed to conspiracy theories and other misinformation, I think the same good decisions are being made by news organizations about what to publish that could affect national security. And more than ever, I think it's very important to be holding this particular administration accountable for its actions, because some of them seem so dangerous.
No, in Dana Priest's story, you withheld the countries,
Yes.
Lithuania, Poland, and Romania.
Correct.
What risk is there that another news organization is going to discover the secrets and publish those facts anyway?
Well, that's life. I have to make the right decision for the Washington Post and for myself and live with it. And as it turned out, it took a long time for those countries' names to be revealed. And by the time they were, it was no longer a problem for that other cooperation that was going on with them. The European Union even conducted a formal investigation also, and eventually both it and the Senate committee named the countries. So while I've answered your question, I'm still not naming them myself. So,
okay. How intimidating is it when the president invites you and your publisher to the Oval Office and says you can't?
That's strange. It wasn't. I mean, obviously, it wasn't the first time that I talked to a president. I'd been involved in Washington Post interviews with previous presidents. In fact, even when Lyndon Johnson was president and I was a young reporter, back then he was giving the District of Columbia some limited home rule and called a bunch of us who covered that particular subject into the White House. Most of us had never been there before, into the Oval Office. And it was interesting because as an investigative reporter, I noticed that on our way in, he was standing with his back to us in front of his desk, turning over all the papers on his desk so we couldn't read them while we were crowded around the desk talking to him. And because there have been occasions when I have read the papers in people's desks when I was interviewing them. So he was smart about that. But so the White House was not intimidating to me. The President Bush conducted himself in a proper manner and so on. And clearly the seriousness of the moment was important to me, not because I was in the Oval Office, but because of the stakes involved in reporting on this particular covert operation.
And I just want to remind the audience, you're welcome to submit questions in the chat, and I'll make sure I get to them. I'm pretty close to wrapping up my conversation points with Len, and can turn to your questions. Len, in hindsight, are there secrets that you wished you had disclosed or reported out more fulsomely? No,
there was never anything that we never eventually reported. While Ben was still editor, I'm sorry, there was one. It took too long to make a decision, and that was something called Ivy Bells, which was a national security agency, low-level employee who never should have had access to this information, sold to the Russians information that the United States was tapping their undersea cables that they used to communicate with their submarines. A very big secret. He was arrested, and they never said what he was arrested for, and he was going to be tried. And they weren't going to say what he was being tried exactly for, just for espionage. And Bob Woodward, of course, and another reporter at that time at the Post named Pat Tyler, discovered what it was, discovered that this was the secret. And Ben and I were put under great pressure from the head of the National Security Administration, other administration officials, to not publish the story. We consulted with former directors of the CIA to get their advice. Always when we come up with some of these, we don't just go ahead and do it. We consult with the government. We want to know what first of all, we want to know if our information is accurate. And then secondly, if it is accurate, are there dangers involved that they want to talk to us about? And then we have to make a decision about what to do. They kept coming up with new reasons why we shouldn't publish the story. And as a result, we just went month after month after month without making a decision. Finally, NBC News on the eve of the trial broke part of the story. They named the Ivy Bells and just a little bit of it. And so we were able to we just decided to run the full story the next day. But that's when I decided that when I ran the paper, when I was going to run the paper later, that I would not wait that long. And in the case of the CIA secret prisons, for instance, I set myself a deadline for making a decision on that story.
Because governments can drag out these negotiations or these requests.
Correct. That's their objective.
In the modern era, these national security stories, more than most, rely on confidential sources who are at risk of leaks investigations. These days, with digital breadcrumbs and our smartphones and cameras everywhere, how effectively can a reporter really maintain the secrecy of a confidential source? Yeah,
I wrote about this in the two Committee to Protect Journalists reports I did on first the Obama administration in the press and then the Reagan administration in the press. Excuse me, the Trump administration in the press, and the fact that they have both those administrations prosecuted news sources, as you know, from an investigation that involved the AP when you worked there, and how intimidating this was to the press to have their sources to be prosecuted for talking to them. And so they and their sources have adopted all kinds of things now with different ways to use cell phones, encrypted information. Dana Priest, when she was working in the CIA story, we talked about even bought some burner phones like a drug dealer would, but then decided that her sources probably would not want to be communicating with her that way. It's a race right now. It's a race between the reporters and their sources on the one hand, and law enforcement administration on the other hand, to try to conduct secret communications.
You worked for the Post in the UK, and among other stories, covered Charles and Diana.
Yes.
What was Prince Charles like, especially toward American journalists?
Right. Well, thanks to the fact that I befriended his press secretary, which is always good advice to reporters. Find the press secretaries, get to know them well. That certainly was very helpful for me with covering Margaret Thatcher and covering Prince Charles and covering the Queen. I knew her press secretary too. So his press secretary, I was becoming president of the American Correspondents Association a year after I began to know his press secretary. I knew that was in the offing because I was vice president at the time. And it was a fairly large organization at the time. Now there are not so many reporters there, but there were a lot there then. And so we managed to get on the president's schedule a year in advance, a dinner that I hosted for him with the American Correspondents Association in Brown's Hotel in London. And so I was sitting with him at the head table. And it was interesting because he felt so much more at ease with Americans, as he told us, than he felt with British people, because they treated him like some kind of freak all the time and couldn't really converse with him. And we just treated him like another news source, except for my good friend, the late Peter Jennings, who's Canadian, and he called me Your Royal Highness all the time through dinner. The rest of us did not bother with such niceties, but it was very revealing because he talked about, it was clearly, I felt sorry for him because he clearly talked with some regret about the fact that he couldn't become king until his mother died. And today he's still king, and he's a very old man. He'll be even older by the time that he's able to become king. And so he was kind of defensive about what his job was because he's not allowed to make policy or anything. The royal family's not allowed to make policy or anything like that. And so the relatively mundane things he was doing. Later on, I think he became much more of an environmentalist and started a sort of green movement that he's been involved in, which is fine for the royal family. And interestingly, when we first arranged dinner, he'd never even met Lady Diana. By the time the dinner occurred, we were just weeks away from the royal wedding, and he talked all about the great show they were going to put on, how wonderful the royal wedding is going to be to show off Britain, without really talking about his relationship with Diana at all, which I found kind of curious. And obviously subsequent events showed something about that.
Len, here's a question from the audience. Trust in news and news organizations are near historically low. What can news organizations do to restore trust in journalism?
They need to keep doing their work as well as they possibly can. Journalists have never been popular in opinion polls. Journalists always seem to rank just above used car salesmen and members of Congress in most public opinion polls, because good journalists publish things that make people unhappy, make people mad, that they don't want uncovered, or things that are terrible that they would feel better if they weren't being reported. However, it is worse now because of all the different things that are lumped together as media. So, the news media themselves, the fact-finding news media, are only part of all the information and misinformation that's being showered on people through the internet nowadays, and on cable television and so on. So it's harder to sort out the facts from the opinion and the truth-telling from the misinformation. So what news organizations need to do is to keep doing their work, because I see when the big stories break, even though there are people, including the president, might be unhappy about them, you see that they have very strong readership and that they have impact on the population. So you can see that people are still paying attention to truth-telling news media and accountability journalism. However, at the same time, the news media have to be more transparent about their work, and they're trying to be, to show people how. That's one of the reasons I wrote this book, is I wanted American readers to be able to see what really goes on inside a news organization. And what I wrote about in the book's not much different from what goes on inside the Washington Post today or the New York Times today, so they can see that we're not biased, we're not partisan, we're working very hard to get the facts straight. We take seriously investigative reporting that holds power accountable, et cetera, et cetera. And so being transparent that way is one thing. And then lastly is reaching audiences in different ways than we used to before. So news organizations like New York Times and Washington Post now reach millions more people than they did before through all kinds of channels on the internet. And therefore, that fact-finding journalism is more available for people to compare to the misinformation that they're also seeing.
Len, when you worked at the Post, speaking of nonpartisanship, you famously didn't even vote in political elections, and you didn't read your newspaper's editorials or columns.
Right.
You wrote in your book that today, with all the accusations of news bias, it's more important than ever for truth-seeking journalists to avoid all appearances of bias and let their work speak for itself. It needs to be all about the story. We're in an era of personal branding and social media curation,
right, where
edginess can be a currency. Is it reasonable to expect journalists to be disengaged politically?
Nonpartisan and disengaged politically, yes. Obviously, opinion journalists are fine, and that's their job, to express opinions, express it on cable TV, express it in the newspaper, and on the web, and so on. That's fine. But those who are engaged in the reporting, the factual reporting, should be disengaged from politics. And in fact, even though I didn't vote for the 24 years I ran the Post, because I was the final decision maker, and I did not want to make up my mind who should be president of the United States or mayor of Washington or anything else. I wanted to keep a completely open mind. However, members of our staff could vote. But at the same time, then and now, members of the Washington Post news staff, not the opinion writers, but the others, members of the Washington Post news staff, opinion writers also cannot engage in political activity. They cannot support candidates. They cannot work for candidates. They cannot contribute to candidates or political parties or partisan groups. They cannot sign petitions. They cannot march in demonstrations, etc. And that's important to demonstrate that they're not engaged in partisan activity, and hopefully to keep as open a mind as possible. And so that when they're doing their reporting, they're having open minds.
We have a generation of young journalists who are so socially active and aware. How can or should they express their personal support for basic civil rights, such as freedom from discrimination about race or gender or ethnicity or sexuality?
Yeah.
What if a reporter wants to march in a Black Lives Matter protest? What advice would you give to them?
I don't think reporters should march in marches, period, demonstrations, period. Expressing your concerns about racial issues, about gender issues, about all sorts of things like that in a nonpartisan way is fine. But as I tell my students, remember, you are establishing your permanent record, your lifetime permanent record by everything that you post on social media, including just what you share with friends. And as a result, 20 years from now, 25 years from now, when you're engaged in some really important accountability reporting or covering an intense campaign, and somebody who doesn't like what you're reporting, because it could be the candidate, could be a presidential candidate, will say, wait a minute, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, here's what you said all over social media. You're biased against me. You can't cover me. And so you want to avoid that. If you're serious about the mission of nonpartisan factual journalism, you want to avoid having a permanent record that would raise questions about partisanship. And I know that means that you're giving up some of your rights as a citizen in order to join with your fellow journalists in the very aggressive First Amendment rights you have to seek out the truth.
Another question from the audience. You talked about the first time the Post reported on a congressman who had been involved in a drunken driving crash and having an affair. What do you think about the current level of reporting on political candidates' personal lives?
I have not seen much that I find out of bounds. You have to be careful because you're getting more false information all the time sent to you. And in fact, a lot of it even appears on the internet, false information. You can't just follow along and report that. You need to follow my rules. You need to make sure it's true. You need to be able to prove it's true, and you need to be able to find that it's, you need to be able to decide that it is germane, relevant to their performance as a candidate or as a public official. And I see that going on all the time, and it's extremely important. And in addition, I think that there's more reporting now about mistreatment of women by people in power, not just political power, but obviously economic power. And that's really important in aggressive investigative reporting. And I know there'll be more of it, and that's great. And we're seeing the same thing in racial issues, where police brutality and other instances of racial discrimination that were not being widely reported before are being more aggressively reported now, and that's good.
Lynn, how did you know that investigative reporting was what you wanted to specialize in?
Yeah, I don't think I guess when I was a kid, I delivered the Cleveland Press, a now long gone newspaper in Cleveland. It was a hard charging a paper that did do investigative reporting at a time when there wasn't much of it. It was mostly about crime at that time and organized crime. And its editor, Louis Self, considered a crusading editor, and I that certainly made an impression on me. And I heard him speak once. My dad took me to hear him speak at some school about a book he had written when I was maybe 11, 12 years old, around that same time that I was just getting started in journalism in elementary school. And so that did make an impression on me. But then it was something in my background, I guess, at Ohio State. I did some investigative reporting. I was thrust into it by events. So in covering the events, I pursued them further. But it was really at the Post when I discovered some stories, literally on night police as a young 23-year-old reporter, that led to that investigative reporting at the courts. And I realized that this was going to be my life's work. And yeah, even as an editor, investigative reporting was one of the things I focused most of my attention on.
Lynn, speaking of life's work, you went through a couple of marriages over the course of your career, and you note in your book that the newspaper was a significant cost to your family and relationships, just how much time it took.
Yes.
What advice do you have for a young journalist about work-life balance, and how consuming is this profession? It
is consuming. And I give my students, I tell them this all the time, that you need to regard this profession as a mission. more nowadays than ever before, because it's more demanding than ever before. There's a 24-hour news cycle.
Are you listening?
So and there are all these different skills that you need to have, and so it's more consuming than ever. And so you need to understand it is going to impinge on your social life, and you have to realize that in arranging your family life, you're going to have to figure out a way to balance family life with your work in a way in which work is going to take most of the time.
Lynn, the Trump administration has changed the relationship between the political class and news organizations. Other presidents, like Nixon, complained about their press coverage, but nobody has done it the way that President Trump has done.
Right.
Do you see that pendulum swinging back after Trump leaves office, whether that's in 2020 or 2024?
I hope so. I hope this is an aberration. I mean, as you say, all presidents have tried to control their coverage as best they could. But never have the attacks been this virulent, and never have they convinced a large part of the American people to not trust fact-finding news media. And that is a very serious issue for our democracy. And so I hope that the next non-Trump administration, and I trust that it will first stop those attacks. I fully expect them to try to control their message. Yeah, that's all right. That's fine. That's the push and pull between politicians and the press. But I hope that they will endeavor to increase trust in the media. It's not, the distrust is not going to go away, because I assume that any non-Trump administration will be opposed by those people in the media right now, on both sides, on the left and the right, who try to cast doubt all the time on fact-finding media. And so they will continue to do that, and it will continue to be a struggle, but I hope it won't be as severe a struggle as currently the case.
Lynn, I want to give you a few closing minutes here to talk about your book, All About the Story: News, Politics, Power, and
I guess I can't, it's non-video participants, so I guess they can't see it. I can't hold it up.
It's a great book. I read it over the weekend. It's a fast read, and it's well organized. Some real insights into your relationship with Bob Woodward and Ben Bradlee. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
You know, are people coming to you and saying what were they most surprised about in your book?
What were they most surprised about? Well, even to the minor extent to which I revealed anything about my personal life, that was surprising to people, because I don't talk much about that. Mostly it's just learning about what went on the inside. The stories are familiar. This is all part of history now, going back to Watergate and before. And to learn how the journalism is done and what my role was in it, how I made decisions in particular, because everybody knows what these decisions were, but they didn't know how they were arrived at. And I think all of that is very revealing for people to read the book.
Well, thank you very much. We appreciate your time, and thank you everyone for joining us. I guess that's a wrap. Thanks very much, Lynn.
Thanks to you, and thanks to the University of Florida. I'll mention the title one more time: All About the Story: News, Power, Politics, and the Washington Post.